Hey guys, the Bourbon Nerd here. Welcome to the very first lesson in my bourbon school. I really hope you will embrace this concept. I'm very excited to go through all these lessons with you. And of course, the topic of the first lesson is what is bourbon? Basically, bourbon is just a type of whiskey. Just like Scotch whiskey is a type of whiskey and Irish whiskey is a type of whiskey. So what I'll be covering in this lesson is basically the 7 most important rules in connection with bourbon. But also at the end, I will give my version of the top 5 misunderstandings there are out there in connection with bourbon, because there are quite a few misunderstandings out there. And just to take myself through this lesson, I'm actually having a little dram myself. So maybe you should consider pausing the video at this point if you don't already have something in your glass. Worthwhile considering, of course. So what I've chosen for this one is a very nice whiskey from Wyoming Whiskey, one of my favorite manufacturers. Okay, I digress. Let's get started. So the most important rule in connection with bourbon, as you can see on the screen now, is that it has to be made in the United States. So it can be made anywhere in the United States, all 50 states, and as you can see on the picture here, actually including the territories. So technically you could make bourbon in Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands or Guam. I'm not really sure if bourbon's made there, but technically you could do that. And this all started back in 1964, and this weird picture here I have on the screen is Congress actually passed a law in 64 where it identified bourbon as a distinctive spirit or product rather of the United States. And that's actually because before that there was a lot of really bad bourbon made in both Canada and Mexico, and so the value of bourbon really decreased. So 1964 they agreed it had to be made in the United States. So that is the most important rule. So that's rule 1 out of 7. If we go to the next one, is that you probably heard this before, the mash bill need to consist of minimum 51% corn. If you don't know what a mash bill is, don't worry, I'll cover that in upcoming lessons, but it's basically the recipe of the corn mix that each manufacturer decide to go into their specific product. You can do as many different variations as you want with bourbon, as long as minimum 51% are made out of corn. It can be 70, 80, and it can actually also be 100, but minimum 51% corn. So that's very important. The third rule, and that's also very important, is when you distill the spirit, and I'll cover in upcoming lessons a lot about how you actually make whiskey, you can only go to 160 proof or 80% ABV. The reason why they made this rule is that the higher proof you distill your whiskey at, the less taste there is and the less sort of reminiscence that comes from the actual grain there. So you don't want to get too high, because otherwise you get into vodka land where it almost tastes like nothing, alcohol with water basically, and we don't want that. We want our really good and nice tasting whiskey, of course. So they made this rule, 160 proof maximum out of the distillery production. Rule number 4, very important, it has to be aged in a new charred oak container. So 4 words there. Has to be new, so it can only be used one. It has to be charred on the inside, and I'll cover in depth why that is and how they came up with this rule in an upcoming lesson. It has to be an oak container. No other type of wood is permissible. It doesn't have to be American wood. It doesn't have to be American oak. It just have to be oak. And it actually says container there as well. In reality, it means barrel. Everybody's using barrels, but you could use a bucket. It would be pretty crazy, right? I mean, who wants to have whiskey aged in a bucket? But you could technically do that. So that's rule number 4. Very important. Rule number 5. This is also to make sure that the quality is okay. So once you have distilled the product on your distillery equipment, remember 160 proof max, when you put it into the barrel, it can only be 125 proof or 62.5 ABV. The reason for that is that it would be tempting maybe for the manufacturers to just put it in directly at 160 proof, because then they would just be able to add a lot of water by the end of the maturation period to get down to this proof level that they want on their existing products. The more water is of course much cheaper than whiskey, so it also dilutes sort of the value a little bit. So they came up with this rule to make sure that, I wouldn't say cheating, but to make sure the manufacturers don't put too much water into it. It's 125 maximum. Actually used to be 110 in the old days. And some manufacturers still use 110, but 125 is the maximum permissible. All right, that was rule number 5. I'm actually getting a little thirsty here, so cheers, y'all. Oh, this is amazing. Anyway, where were we? Yeah, rule number 6. So, and this is also very important for bourbon. So, when the whiskey has been aged in the barrel and you want to put it into the bottle, the only thing you can add there is water. You are not allowed to put caramel coloring in there or something else. So in case you wonder what this weird E150A is all about, so that's actually the technical term for coloring, or caramel coloring. It's actually okay. It doesn't taste like anything. It's not dangerous or at all, but it does change the natural color. So in Scotland and other places in the world, you are allowed to add coloring, but not for bourbon. So that's actually a very important rule as well. And then the final rule that I have chosen out of, there are a handful more, is also very important. So when, and this goes for all of the United States and all of Europe and other places in the world as well, you cannot sell a product that is called a bourbon or whiskey for that matter, unless the ABV or the proof is 80 or the ABV is 40 in the bottle itself. So that is the minimum permissible proof level of a bottle of whiskey. So you see here, I actually have a bottle of Jim Beam here on the screen. And if I zoom in a little bit there, you can actually see it says 37%, which is 74 proof. So what on earth is going on there? Can you guess? So I'll tell you right now, of course. So there are certain areas in the world, just in case you come across these bottles, especially in Australia and New Zealand, where because of historic things and taxation, that it's actually permissible to go below the 80 proof or 74 proof in this level. So this is not normal. You will never see this in the United States, and you will never see this in Europe. So that's a reason for that. So that in itself are the basic rules that governs bourbon. A few more out there, but they are minor details. But now you know exactly what makes up a bourbon. And then as promised, I will give you my take of some of the most normal misunderstandings that are out there with bourbon. And you may have heard one or two of these as well. So just pausing a little bit. Cheers. I can maybe give you a little trick while we're at it. So when you smell a bourbon or any high spirit, if you part the lips a little bit, just like this, then it's actually easier to get into the notes of the whiskey itself. The alcohol gets a little away with this trick. So if nothing else, you can get this from this video. Anyway, okay. So misunderstanding number 1. So bourbon must be made in Kentucky. I cannot tell you how many times I heard this. It's not true. It can be made in all the 50 states and all the territories. Not anywhere else in the world, in the United States. But I'll grant it that 90 to 95% of all bourbon is actually made in Kentucky. I'll explain why in an upcoming lesson. But it can be made anywhere in the US. So misunderstanding number 2 is that bourbon must be aged for a minimum of 2 years. This is not true. There are no age requirements for bourbon. A bourbon can be stored or aged for 1 second and it will be called bourbon. Heck, you can store it for 1 second in a bucket, as we just discussed before, and it will still be bourbon. I mean, you wouldn't be able to sell the product, I guess. I at least wouldn't buy it, but technically you could do that. So where this 2-year thing comes from, you may have heard about the term straight. seen the word straight on a bottle of whiskey. So if the word straight is used on a bottle of whiskey, straight Kentucky whiskey or straight whatever whiskey, then it has to be minimum 2 years. So if you hear this misunderstanding, it's probably coming back to this reference to the word straight. And then the third one is that bourbon is named after either Bourbon County in Kentucky or Bourbon Street in New Orleans, Louisiana. Well, no one really knows. No one really knows who gave the name to bourbon whiskey. The word bourbon itself comes from the French royal family, Maison de Bourbon. They were very, very active, and there was a lot of French people in the southern part of the United States, as you probably heard about the Louisiana Purchase and all that. So, of course, that was very popular, and that gave the name from the French royal family to both Bourbon County and Bourbon Street in New Orleans. So no one really knows where it came from. We'll actually, in one of the coming lessons, go a little bit more into the historic aspect of this, and it leans a little bit towards Bourbon Street, I would say, rather than Bourbon County, but let's see what comes up there. Then number 4, this is a classic one. Elijah Craig invented bourbon. So actually, let me see here. Yeah. If I take one of these, right? Elijah Craig from Heaven Hill, and if you look at this on the side here, I'll say father of bourbon, right? So of course, the story goes that the minister Elijah Craig, he had a lot of barrels in his barn or whatever. Lightning struck. Some of his barrels got burned, especially on the inside. He didn't have the nerve to or the heart to throw them out. So he actually filled whiskey in it anyway, and it turned out that it was a much better way to store whiskey with their charred or burned barrels, which I will explain in upcoming lessons. And sort of he would then claim with inventing bourbon. It's a great story. It really is. And I so wish it was true, but we don't think it is. No one really knows who did it, but I will explain also in an upcoming lesson some of the maybe more likely stories behind who invented bourbon other than Elijah Craig. So sorry about that, Elijah. And then finally, bourbon is not whiskey. Oh my God, the number of times I've heard this. It's like, I'm not into bourbon, I'd rather whiskey. Or, do you prefer bourbon or whiskey? That statement does not make sense because bourbon is whiskey. Bourbon is a type of whiskey, and as I said in the beginning of this video here. So if you ever hear someone asking you, do you prefer bourbon or whiskey? Tell them, dude, bourbon is whiskey. And that was my proposal for the big 5 misunderstandings of bourbon. Thank you for listening.